All right. How's it going, everybody? Welcome to the Park Score podcast. Today with me, I have Jerry Marzinsky. So, Jerry is actually a retired licensed psychotherapist with over 35 years of experience working with and studying the thought processes and the voices heard by psychotic and criminally insane patients in some of the most volatile psychiatric institutions in the nation. And he was awarded with the state of Arizona's Meritorious Service Award while working in the psychology department of a large state prison. He was also awarded the Pimas College Apple Award for the teaching of abnormal psychology. Jerry has held the position of second lieutenant in the Arizona Civil Air Patrol and is a licensed commercial pilot, a certified scuba diver, and a long distance motorcycle rider. So sort of a jack of all trades, if you ask me. He's also served as an assistant scoutmaster. His formal academic training comprises a BA in psychology from Temple University, a master's degree in counseling from the University of Georgia, and 2 years of study in a PhD psychology program. He is co-author of An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind, Breaking the Spell of the Ivory Tower, which I have right here. And actually, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, guys, the whole reason I came across Jerry's work was a friend of mine recommended me to his work because we had been doing a series where we talked about the nature of different sorts of entities, whether it be in pagan religions or people having psychedelic experiences, what have you. We kind of went on this series where we were talking about various contact with entities, and he actually pointed me to Jerry's work, which I found very interesting because well, I'll just let Jerry kind of give you guys an intro to his study and what he does. So, Jerry, how are you doing today?
Yep, doing good.
So do you want to just give the audience kind of an intro into like how you got into this field of work and sort of what kind of puts you on this beat?
Well, that's a long story. I'll start into it. As when I got into college, I didn't know what I wanted to do. But when I hit my first abnormal psychology course, I was absolutely fascinated. I was like, what's going on with these people? And they didn't have any reason for it. What they had was a lot of classifications, mental health classifications and descriptions. And they looked pretty official. And what they were doing was describing how the mental illness presented itself. But there was nothing there about what caused it or what to do about it. You know? So one thing I hated about traditional psychology is you couldn't get access to a clinical population. So you can read about all these things, but trying to get into a mental institute or a psychiatric hospital or any kind of psychiatric board, they wouldn't let you in there. They'd make up every excuse in the book. Oh, it's too dangerous. We don't want to take the risk. Uh, Everything under the sun. So you had to believe what they said.
Mhm.
And I remember in abnormal psychology class, we were assigned a uh, article written by a clinical psychologist that basically said if two crazy people, if each of them thought they were Maxine Maxwell, one of them would have to give way. You
Mhm.
know, they both couldn't be Maxine. One of them had to change their delusion. And I'm like, why would that have to happen? Why can't two crazy people just be crazy independently? I mean, why would one of them, because they're irrational anyway, why would they have to change? And there was no way to find that out. There was no way. So I just tucked it in the back of my head. Fast forward, probably another what, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, 6 or 7 years. I got hired at one of the biggest psychiatric hospitals on the planet in Georgia, Central State Hospital in Georgia. It was massive. There were close to 10,000 patients there when I got there, and 200 buildings. And I was assigned to one psychiatric unit, and I was doing rounds one day, and here was this fellow, looked like he was talking to somebody that I couldn't see. And what it presented as is like one side of a um, telephone conversation where you could hear the person talking, but you couldn't hear who was talking back.
Mm.
So he was carrying on a conversation with something or somebody I couldn't see. Um, and in school, all they taught you were that what these voices were that these people were supposed to be hearing were hallucinations.
Mm.
They didn't say anything in detail about them. Um, so I'm going, well, what's going on here? It didn't sound, what he was saying didn't sound like word salad. So when you think about a hallucination, you think of something that's just totally irrational and just crazy. Um, that's not what I was seeing. And I saw that time after time after time. I saw one lady who was arguing with her voices that she didn't want to leave the hospital grounds and was arguing with her voices against leaving the hospital grounds as she was leaving the hospital grounds. So I'm like, no, what's going on with that? What are these voices saying? What are they telling these people? Um, so I tried to creep up behind this fella, and he caught me. And I introduced myself. I'm Jerry. I'm the psych on this unit. Um, I hadn't seen you before. What's your name? And he looked me right in the eye and he says, I'm Jesus Christ. And I thought a minute and then, thought back to that article that I read 6 years ago.
Mm.
And I looked him in the eye and I said, no, you can't be Jesus Christ. I said, because I am. And I'm sitting there waiting. Okay, what's he going to do?
Mm.
Is he going to change like that article said he would?
Mm.
And he's thinking about it and he cocks his eyes up and he's like, wondering. And then he comes to a conclusion. He looks at me and he goes, okay, we can both be Jesus Christ. And he strolls off. And I'm like, okay, what other lies did they tell me?
Mm.
I didn't trust authority at all, especially an authority where you couldn't check into what they were teaching you. You had to take their word for it.
Mm.
You know? I didn't like that at all about psychology. The only thing you could really check on was experimental psychology, where you go into a rat lab and you can actually see what they're talking about. You could predict it.
Mm.
So later I found out that they did a big national survey and they found that 80% of what psychologists published was not replicable.
Mm.
80% of it was bullcrap.
Mm.
And I saw that when I was in school. I mean, in graduate school, the professors had to publish or perish. So if they didn't publish, they couldn't advance.
Mm.
So they needed to be making the school a reputation for itself. And they were just publishing garbage. And when I got into the PhD program, that verified itself. They were just publishing garbage.
Mm.
It's like just publish anything and just get it published. It friggin' didn't matter whether it was true or not. Matter of fact, there was one time where the head of the psychology department in this PhD program brought all the second year students together, and we were going, well, I wonder what all this is about. He was teaching us how to cheat with statistics. And I'm watching what he's doing, and I'm no statistician for sure, but by then I'd had, several advanced statistics classes pounded down my throat. And he was presenting a normal population distribution as the end 10% of that population. So it was deceptive,
Mm.
and I raised my hand and I said, how can you do that? I mean, that's not viable. That what you're presenting is doesn't make any sense. And I said, you know, what are you doing? And he said, Well, if they're not smart enough to catch it, that's their problem. And it blew my mind. It just
Yeah.
boom, you know. And I looked around at all the other students, and all of them were looking up at him, going, "Oh, that's how it is," except one other student. And we looked at each other, and then we didn't want to look at each other very long because we were afraid he'd catch us,
Hmm.
you know. So they were teaching us how to be duplistic,
Hmm.
and so that that hit me pretty hard. It's like, how can I believe anything these people are saying after that? The head of the department getting up there and teaching us how to cheat and lie.
Hmm.
Um, so when I got onto the to the psychiatric units at the state hospital, um, nobody was interested in the voices. I mean, here's these. I was working for the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation. What we were charged with doing was finding the highest functioning patients there, training them in some vocation, and then getting them out of the hospital. Okay. And what happened was the highest functioning of these people were usually the schizophrenics, but they wouldn't stay on their medications.
Hmm.
And then when they went off their medications, they went crazy. They went nuts. So here I watched them as they sabotaged themselves time after time as they came close to graduating. Um, they would do something to sabotage themselves. You know, they'd get in trouble. They'd go off their medicine. They'd get into a fight. They'd get in an argument in class. They'd do something to sabotage themselves, and it was consistent. It's like, why are they doing that? And then tracking them after they left, it would be within 6 months. A lot of them would have gone off their medications. I'm like, well, why is that happening? And they were going off their medications even at the hospital where they were being handed to them, you know, right there.
Hmm.
You know, they would tuck them under their tongue, they would spit them out later. So, you know, I'd ask them, well, why'd you do that? Do you want to go crazy? And they said, no, I don't want to go crazy. But they said the side effects are awful. And they were.
Hmm.
You know, these
Right.
drugs are very toxic. They had nasty, nasty side effects and a long list of them.
Yeah.
So, you know, that made sense. And then I did another experiment with, I went to the DSM, the Directory of Statistical Mental Illness things, a description of all these mental illnesses. And I went to paranoid schizophrenia and I got all the negative symptoms of that, plus the ones that I'd seen for myself. And I wrote them down and made a check sheet out of them.
Hmm.
So every time one of the patients that I had on my caseload went off his meds, after he was put back on them, I brought him into my office and I said, well, why'd you go off your meds? And the consistent answer was the side effects are awful. And they were toxic. They were, those meds they are toxic. You know, they do bad things to the body. They shrink your brain. They make you feel like a zombie. They feel you, it's like you have sludge in your system. They make you nervous and sedated at the same time. They
Hmm.
cause shaking and I mean the side effects are just awful.
Hmm.
Um, so I'd ask them, well, you know, why don't you go off your meds? I'm expecting the side effects. All right. And they would, they'd say the side effects. And I said, okay, well, here's another list of the characteristics of paranoid schizophrenia. You know, and there were hallucinations and delusions and, you know, seeing monsters and being paranoid and, um, you know, just losing it. Just this whole list of symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia. And I'd give them a blank piece of paper and I'd say, okay, write down the symptoms that you had when you went off, when you were taking your meds, because they didn't all have the same side effects.
Right.
And they'd write down a handful, you know, sexual dysfunction, nervous irritability, um, you know, dry mouth, uh, feeling like a zombie. I mean, they'd write them down. They were bad side effects. And then I'd take that sheet and I'd give them the second sheet with all the symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia, what it was like to go insane.
Mhm.
And I'd say, okay, check all of the symptoms of, your diagnosis you had when you went off your meds. And they checked them all. And then I'd hand both sheets back to them and I'd say, which one was worse? What's worse, going off your meds or going psychotic?
Mhm.
Every single one of them said going psychotic.
Mhm.
Uh, and I'd say, well, if you didn't want to go psychotic, then why did you go off your meds? Because you've done this a number of times before. And each time you went crazy.
Mhm.
Uh, so why did you do that? And what do you think they said? Hold on one second. I got to flip two switches. I'll be back in a second.
Yeah, of course. So guys, up until this point, Jerry's kind of been giving us a background on how he sort of got into this sort of work. And while he's away, I wanted to just go ahead and give a brief intro into why, I was so interested in what he was doing in the first place, which is that, in the past couple episodes, we've been going over various sorts of supernatural experiences that
Got
people
it.
have. Oh yeah.
Yeah,
So I was just giving people kind of an intro into part of the reason why I'm so interested in, the work that you've been doing. And it's that essentially, in Western medicine, we have this idea. You outline the source of it in Hippocrates all the way back. I think it's I don't know how far back. I think 300 BC or something like that. But essentially, oh yeah, 375 BC. This idea that all illness is purely physical, and it seems like the medical establishment or just the culture of Western medicine has essentially been operating on this idea since Hippocrates, first conceived of it. And there's a massive spiritual component missing here. We're sort of almost acting like it doesn't exist. Um,
right.
and in the case of schizophrenics, this really seems to come to the fore because, we're treating them with these certain medications, these certain prescriptions that are, in some sense sedating them, in some sense treating some of the symptoms, but not really getting at the root of, what's really causing these pathologies. And so, anyways, if you'd like to go ahead and continue. Um,
Yeah, you were talking about
yeah,
symptoms.
we're talking about, yeah, how
So,
they,
so,
yeah.
so here's just a few side effects of these antipsychotic meds: muscle rigidity, brachinesia, significantly slowed movements. I mean, they're drugged up.
Mhm.
Uh, Dystonia, involuntary muscle movements and contractions. When that starts happening, there's damage. There's neurological damage actually taking place. There's muscle tremor, akinesia, restlessness, a feeling of one needs to be in constant motion all the time. Tardive dyskinesia, involuntary movements of the face, the mouth, the lips. So they start this tongue darting, or the lips are start moving around.
Mhm.
Um, there's neuroleptic malignant syndrome, serious and often life-threatening condition that's characteristic by muscle rigidity, fever, sweating, irregular heartbeat, blood pressure changes. Um, these drugs are toxic.
Mhm.
They don't cure anything. All
Mhm.
they do is dumb the people down. They're basically major tranquilizers.
Mhm.
So they're treating symptoms. They're not treating the cause because they don't know what the cause is. So they keep making up causes,
Mhm.
and those causes keep getting disproved.
Mhm.
Even today, they don't know what it is.
Mhm.
So they started out blaming mothers, saying mothers did something to their kids that made them schizophrenic.
Mhm.
And the mothers, well, what'd we do? So that's observable. So they kick it up into an area that isn't observable to 98% of the population. They go, oh well, it's a genetic abnormality. you know, and who's going to disprove that except geneticists? So they got away with that, I don't know for how many years, a decade at least, probably. saying, "Oh, it's genetic," and then by the time the geneticists got to looking at it, they didn't find anything there. So here comes the big pharma and the psychiatric mafia come back and go, well, it's not just one gene. They're not finding one gene. It's the interaction of a lot of genes all mixed together, and they're all doing something to make the schizophrenia. We'll find it eventually,
Mhm.
but they haven't found it. And the
Mhm.
geneticists are saying there is no genetic marker for schizophrenia. Right? But they're still using that. But when the geneticist um, said there's nothing there. So they kicked it up into another area. And this was Eli Lilly back in the 70s when they came up with Prozac, a drug company. They completely made up this biochemical imbalance nonsense.
Right. Right. Right.
Just
Right.
it was a complete lie. They knew it at the time. They
Mhm.
went with it anyway,
Mhm.
right? Telling people the reason that people are depressed or they're mentally ill is because of a biochemical imbalance in their brain. Right? They got away with that for more than a decade again, because who's going to prove that? You need a biochemist to prove that.
Right.
And they didn't get around to it. So finally, some honest biochemists did start checking into that, and they didn't find any biochemical imbalance in the brain of schizophrenics.
Mhm.
You know? And they um, yeah, they proved that, you know, but they're still advertising that to sell their psychiatric drugs.
Mhm.
You still see, oh, it's believed that, you know. Um, so they kept pushing it, but the biochemists they just kept at it. So they go to well, what they found was that the brains of psychiatric patients that had been in psychiatric hospitals for long periods of time, like state hospitals, they've been in there for years and they've been giving these antipsychotic drugs. When they did autopsies on them, their brains were shrunk like walnuts, you know, almost all of them. So they went, wait a second, these drugs must be doing this, you know. Of course, the drug companies went nuts and go, oh, no, no, it's not our drugs. It's the schizophrenia doing that. So the biochemists went, okay, well, let's see about that. So they started feeding these drugs to rats and mice and monkeys and found that their brains shrunk also. Right? So these drugs are not only curing nothing, they're causing long-term neurological damage.
Mhm.
They're toxic. They're doing harm.
Mhm.
Right? Now, and here's psychiatry and big pharma saying, okay, if you got schizophrenia, it's a lifetime, uh, it's a life sentence.
Mhm.
It's not. You know, you got to take these drugs until you're dead. Basically, what they're saying. I've heard them say that a number of times. That this is a life sentence. You've got to. The only cure is these drugs, and it's not a cure.
Mhm.
It's just all they're doing is treating symptoms. Right? They're not curing anything. So, like you were saying, schizophrenia is not a physiological disease. That's why they have no answers because
Mhm.
they're treating it like a physiological disease.
Right.
It's not. There is no chemical brain imbalance. There is no genetic markers. And they keep looking at the physical and they're not going to find anything because it's not a physical, disorder. It's a spiritual disorder. Uh, it's non-physical.
Mhm.
Right? So it's a mental disorder, and the voices that these people are hearing, for the most part, are not caused by any kind of um, immediate physical cause. But what you'll find in the background of schizophrenics is there is significant drug abuse. There is significant physical, sexual, or emotional abuse.
Mhm.
Right?
Mhm.
So these voices, when I got to the hospital, nobody was interested in what these voices were telling these patients. And it was clear that the voices were driving the behavior of these patients. They were causing them to do all kinds of crazy stuff, disrupt classes, attack other people, throw tantrums, um, go off their medicines. I mean, all kinds of stuff.
Mm.
And not a single one of those people anywhere in that giant hospital, and there were many hundreds of staff there, were the least bit interested in what these voices were telling these people.
Mm.
You know? So I started asking staff, the doctors, nurses, what are these things? All of them gave the same answer, the same thing that they taught in nursing school, medical school, psychology classes, that they're hallucinations.
Mm.
Right?
Mm.
That's what they're teaching in the universities.
Mm.
That's what they're teaching in the nursing schools. These are hallucinations. So, like, they had no other information about them. Well, what are they saying? Oh, just all kinds of nonsense. No, but it, from what I heard when these people are walking around talking to these voices, it wasn't nonsense.
Right.
These were well formed, complete thoughts. It wasn't word salad. They
Mm.
were carrying on full fledged, coherent conversations with these voices.
Mm.
And it wasn't them, because you could see they would make some kind of argument, and then they'd wait for an answer, and then they'd respond. It was just like somebody's talking on the telephone. Mhm. Or these people walking around with these earbuds where they can hear a phone call. It took me years to get over that. When somebody's walking around just talking to the air, I'm like, there's another one. It's just automatically burned into my nervous system. It took me years to get over that. But that's what it was like.
Mhm.
They're carrying on a coherent conversation with somebody I couldn't see, I couldn't hear. Um, so after a while, I started asking them questions about what these voices were telling them. And it took quite a while um, for them to trust me, because basically what we were kind of spies for psychiatry. You know, we would keep an eye on the population, and if somebody was going nuts, we'd turn them into psychiatry, and psychiatry would up their medicines and drug them more.
Mm.
You
Right.
know, or change their medicine into some other form of toxic junk. Right. So they didn't trust us very well, and it
Right.
took a while to uh, earn their trust. And it was like bit by bit by bit, I would get these little dribbles of what the voices were saying. And uh, it took a while, because there's no practical benefit to them telling me about their voices.
Right.
First of all, the voices don't like it, and they tell them, don't tell this guy anything. There was a couple of times where the voices came to the patient as I was talking to them and said, don't tell him anything else. He knows too much already.
Mm.
And I'm like, whoa,
Yeah.
that's weird.
Hmm.
That happened more than once. Um, but bit by bit, I got to learn about the voices. And then when I got another patient that was willing to tell me a little bit about them, I would tell them what I already knew, and I'd ask them, what else can you tell me? So eventually they got to where, hey, this guy really wants to know about what these things are saying. He's not like the other ones that are just, turning us in all the time. So I started getting more and more pieces of information, about what these things were saying. The more I knew about them, the more they would give me. And then one day, I was asking one guy about his voices, and the voices kind of rebelled, and he walked away kind of pissed off. And he went and he told one of the psychiatrists. The next morning, I ended up in that psychiatrist's office being read the riot act
Mm.
for asking patients about what these voices were telling them. The psychiatrist basically said, you will stop doing this. You're reinforcing their hallucinations and making them worse. Uh,
Mm.
and if you keep doing this, we're going to take action against you.
Hmm.
Uh, so that something like that happened twice while I was at the hospital. So they didn't even want you looking into it.
Right.
Yeah. So I had to really shift down in the first gear and fly under the radar. I didn't stop asking about the voices, um, but I really had to slow it down.
Hmm.
I had to be very careful. You know, um, and I think part of that was the psychiatrists were getting beat up by schizophrenics at a rate higher than any other staff at that hospital. Right?
Right.
And they spent the least time with these people of any of the other staff.
Hmm.
They might spend 15, 20 minutes a month with them. And basically they bring them in, how you doing? How's your meds? Um, do you need any adjustment? Are you still hearing voices? And the patients by then, they learned not to tell the psychiatrists that they were hearing voices, because if they did, they upped their meds and turned them into worse zombies than they already were. All right. So basically that's all they were doing is messing with those medications. They'd either increase them, decrease them, change them around. Um, they didn't spend any time with these guys trying to figure out what was going on with them. And even though that psychiatrist said, well, they're hallucinations, and you're causing more trouble. You're causing these people. You're reinforcing their hallucinations. I knew that was bull crap as soon as it came out of his mouth.
Hmm.
You know, um, but I kept asking, and patterns started appearing with these voices. The first pattern was that they were consistently negative. They never said anything good. They would tell these patients, "You're stupid, you're ugly, you're worthless. Um, Nobody likes you. Your parents are just pretending like they like you. Your girlfriend's cheating on you. Your husband's cheating on you." I mean, it would all be negative stuff all the time. So it wasn't even random.
Right.
So a hallucination, it's random. It's all over the place. Sometimes it might be positive, it might be negative, it might be neutral. It's just all over the place. These these voices weren't random.
Hmm.
You know, that was a consistent pattern. It was the first one that I noticed. And the more I asked the patients about them, the more of them admitted that these things were consistently negative. They were vile. They were evil. They just told rotten stuff all the time. They would make them paranoid. They'd make them feel bad. They'd put them down. They'd tell them they were worthless, that they were stupid, that nobody liked them. And they'd say stuff like, we're figuring out ways to try to kill you. We're just trying to figure out how to do it.
Hmm.
Stuff like that. They'd be talking in the background with whatever the patient did. Um, they'd make up lies like, this guy's going to kill you. Watch out for him, or the police are coming to get you, or it was always negative, paranoid stuff. You know, so I'm like, that's not a hallucination. It's not random. So, the more I picked into it, the second thing that appeared one day, I noticed that when the chaplain at the rehab center would do these ice cream socials, the schizophrenics on my ward would not go. They were the only patients that didn't go. And I said, well, that's odd. I wonder why. Because, cake and ice cream and dancing and music, I mean, those were hard to come by in the psych hospital.
Hmm.
And the first time I noticed that, it was all the schizophrenics were laying in their beds, reading murder mysteries, or, watching TV or something, but they wouldn't go. And second time it happened, I noticed they were there again. They didn't go again. So that got my curiosity up, and I started asking them, how come you're not down there with eating cake and ice cream and listening to music and dancing and stuff? And then they'd say, well, we don't like the chaplain. There is no God. Um, I prayed to Jesus and nothing happened. There's nothing there. I don't like preachers. I don't like church. So they were anti-religious.
Mhm. Mhm.
They didn't want anything to do with religion or God or Jesus or anything like that.
Mhm.
And then one patient came into me one day and he said, I was reading the Bible and the voices went nuts. They don't like the Bible. They won't let me concentrate.
Mhm.
So I started asking other paranoids, schizophrenics, what happens if you try to read the Bible? And it was all the same thing. The voices would kick up. They would say, uh, well, the one that got me the most was they would say, if you're going to read the Bible, you need to read it from cover to cover, okay, and not skip anything. So it would start off in the Old Testament where they were just talking about Jewish history,
Mhm.
and then who begot who, and that went on for 10 pages of who begot who begot who. And when they hit that part, the voices would show up and go, why are you reading this garbage?
Mhm. Mhm.
Look at this is stupid. I mean, you know, um, why are you wasting your time here? And they would lose a lot of them at that point. That they would back out and they would just set it down.
Mhm.
So another guy said when he prayed the 23rd Psalm, the voices reacted like worms thrown on a hot frying pan.
Mhm.
And I went, well, that's interesting. So I started passing out the 23rd Psalm to the schizophrenics I had on my ward, and said, every time the voices come, read this and tell me what happens. And there was a negative reaction. The voices hated it,
Mhm.
and it was consistent,
Mhm.
and it's still consistent. You
Mhm.
know, over years, over decades, it was consistent. The voices hate the 23rd Psalm. They hate the Bible. They hate anything to do with religion.
Mhm.
Um,
Quick
and
question. Quick question. So, one of the something that was interesting is the fact that you had to sort of fly under the radar with a lot of this stuff. So, in your like handing out the 23rd Psalm, was that something that was sort of frowned upon within?
yeah,
So any sort of like here, check out this part. So, how did you kind of navigate that? Like, what was it like to sort of navigate that?
well, uh, I don't think I got into trouble with that at, at the um, at the state hospital.
Mhm.
Um, where did I got in trouble with that when I was working in the psychology department of the state prison.
Mhm.
Okay, I was ordered to stop handing out the 23rd Psalm. They stopped me. You the prison belonged to the negative entities. They ran that place.
Mhm. Right. Right. Something I think you actually cover it in your book is essentially that, a big factor for the you could say personality of these voices is they do sort of seem to feed on negative energy or want to encourage negative thinking and obviously a prison is going to be somewhere that's like,
A hog's trough for them.
oh yeah. Oh yeah,
It's a
absolutely.
hog trough. No good deed went unpunished at that prison.
Right.
You know,
And the 23rd Psalm just for anyone who hasn't heard it before or anything like that, I think it would be interesting to kind of go like at least read through it once just to uh I guess kind of break it apart and see why that one in particular, might be of interest. So it says, "The Lord is my shepherd; I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." And so that's the 23rd Psalm. That was the Psalm that what I thought was interesting is in your book, you said that it was when that was being recited, a lot of times the voices would react as if they were, worms thrown onto a frying pan. I thought that was a like an interesting sort of way of describing it. But yeah, anyways, I just thought it'd be interesting to kind of go into that for a second.
yeah, they hated that. Psalm 91, they didn't like that. They didn't like any prayer. They didn't want the person to go to church. So that was another experiment I did. Was started asking schizophrenic patients what happened when they went to church with the voices. Mm. and I did a just kind of like a survey, and it turned out that if the voices were weak, when they got into the church, the voices would shut up. If the voices were moderate strength, they would pick up and they would start blocking whatever the preacher was saying. So they'd get louder to drown out what he was saying so the patient couldn't concentrate on the sermon. And if they were very strong, they would drive them out of the church. The guy would get up and run out of the church. Mm. So they didn't like church. They didn't like Jesus. They didn't like talks of God. They didn't like sermons. They didn't like preachers. Now what kind of hallucination would do that? And here's the psychiatric mafia insisting that these voices are hallucinations when they knew absolutely nothing about them. They hadn't done any research into them at all. It was like the Egyptian priests of old, where they just said, "We are psychiatry. We hereby declare that these voices are hallucinations merely because we say so." They
Mm-hmm.
haven't done any research, and they still haven't done any research on them.
Mm-hmm.
They're still teaching that these things are hallucinations.
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
know, the third one that showed up at the state hospital was that uh, after the voices attacked, these people were drained. They didn't have any energy, and they didn't even realize that their energy was gone because they felt so bad. Okay, so I did an experiment there too, and it was like it was just a simple, 1 to 10. How much energy did you have before the voices came, and how much energy did you have after they attacked you, right? And I had like I don't know, probably 30 of these things, and I think we ran an analysis of variance on it, and it was statistically significant. After the voices attacked, these guys were drained of energy, right? But they didn't even realize it until you mention it. And once you mention it, and they thought about it, then they would go, "Oh yeah." But it's like they were being prevented from remembering it. That the after the voices came, they didn't have any energy. Um, and then I would ask them, uh, "Well, okay, if your energy disappeared, where did it go?" And they would go, "Well, I don't know." And I'd say, "Well, you've been hearing these voices for years. You must have heard them, thousands and thousands of times. And every time they came and attacked you, your energy was gone. Where do you think it went?" "Well, I don't know." Yeah. And I would say, if you stuck your hand in a fire 1,000 times and every time you got burned, what would be burning you? And they had no trouble with, well, that would be the fire. I said, well, if the voices came 10,000 times and each time your energy had vanished, you know, what do you think? Where do you think your energy went? You go, "Oh, I don't know." So they were, for the most part, I'd say maybe 15% of them would say, "Well, the voices took it," and the rest of them would be, "Well, I don't know where it went." So they were being blocked from realizing that these things were taking and stealing their energy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because there was a one-to-one correlation between their energy disappearing
Mm-hmm.
and the voices attacking them. So the ones who were attacked periodically, I mean, there's some that are under constant attack. They're hearing the voices all the time. They were always drained of energy. But the ones that weren't, where the voices would come and go, after the voices attacked them and left, they were drained of energy,
Mm-hmm.
right? So these things were energetic vampires also. I mean, um, so those three things I learned while I was at the state hospital. And the patterns went on and on. So um, they kept accumulating. So these things consistently, the voices consistently created negative emotion. They foster and create negative emotion. And it appears that that's what they feed on. They are a very low frequency entity. Right? So they want to bring their victims' energy level down because they can't deal with high frequency people. Very spiritual, loving people. They just they can't deal with them. So the voices got louder after sunset. When the sun went down, these things got louder and more vehement, which was interesting. And they have something when I worked at a geriatric center, they had something called sundowner syndrome, where a lot of these old people who were already out of it would get violent after the sun went down. They called it sundowner syndrome.
Mhm.
So here's these patterns that kept showing up over and over. The next one was I remember psychiatrists telling patients, uh, "Oh, just ignore the voices. They're just hallucinations. Just ignore them." And I remember that happened to one guy while I was in the office with him and the psychiatrist. And I called that guy in like a week later. And I said, I was, remember I was in there with you when Dr. So and so told you just to ignore the voices, that they were hallucinations. I asked him, well, how's that going for you? He said, not well. They got louder.
Mhm.
So I went, well, that's odd. So then I started calling in other ones and asking, what happens when you ignore your voices? They said they get louder,
Mhm.
right? That was consistent. So here's another pattern showing up.
Mhm.
Okay? They foster self-destructive behavior. They'll get the person to sabotage themselves. They'll get them to cut on themselves. They'll get them to make suicide attempts. They'll get them to, fail out of classes. They'll get them to commit some kind of crime that gets them thrown in jail. Right? So they foster that. They increase conflict, turmoil, and suffering. They sabotage any positive movement on the part of the patient. The intent of the voices is very different from the intent of their victims. Right? So here's all these patterns that are starting to roll out. They foster isolation. And you see a lot of these schizophrenics, they don't want to be, if they're at home with their parents, they don't want to be around their parents. They want to be locked in a room playing violent video games or just in there by themselves, isolated. And then the parents will hear them in that room apparently talking to themselves. Right? So they don't want the person to have any positive relationships. They break them off. They get them to say stuff that drives away their friends. Um, they get them to scare their friends. They want them isolated from everybody and everything.
Mhm.
Anybody who tries to help them becomes an enemy to the voices, right? And they will try to get the person to drive that person off. So they foster isolation, another pattern that shows up. You know? So these patterns just kept increasing and increasing and increasing. And here's the psychiatric mafia saying, "Oh, yeah, they're just hallucinations. Hallucinations don't run patterns;
Right.
they're random." And these
Right.
people are still pulling that off. You know, so these patterns go on and on and on. You can go to my website at jerrymarzinsky.com and go to articles. And under articles, you can find all these patterns listed. If you're dealing with a schizophrenic or you work with schizophrenics, this is right in front of your face. All you got to do is open your eyes and see it. And once you see it, you know that these are patterns that just keep running over and over and over again. So what the psychiatric mafia is telling you about these voices being hallucinations is a crock of crap. Right? So other ones, they demand the attention of the victim. They maneuver for increased control over the victim. They gaslight. They manipulate perception. They have complete access to the schizophrenic's memory. So that's weird because they're spiritual entities and your memory is energetic. These things are energetic. They can go in there and they can pull up every rotten thing you ever did and they can throw that in your face until they get you negative again. They want to generate that negative emotional energy. That's what they feed off of.
Mhm. Mhm.
So they demand that the victim not tell anybody about them. They don't want them to know. Um, they're consummate liars. You can't believe anything these voices say. There was one patient where they told him if he gouged out his eye, that they would go away and they'd never come back. So he gouges out his eyes. Once he did it, they showed up immediately and started laughing at him and mocking him, saying, look how stupid you are. You believed us.
Mm,
Now you're a freak.
mm,
Everybody's going to bore you. They're not going to be around you. You're going to gross everybody out. And they just tortured him more.
mm,
So they virtually torture these patients. Right? They consistently steer the victim away from anything that might create joy. They don't want them watching any kind of comedy. They don't want them feeling good. They don't want them doing anything that makes them feel good unless there's a negative effect to it, like drugs,
right.
or out of control sex, that kind of stuff.
Mm,
They short circuit reason. You know, um, the worst thing you could do with a schizophrenic is leave him to himself because once they're bored, the voices just, you know, they have complete access. You need to keep these guys busy doing something. You know, the voices try to pass themselves off as thoughts belonging to the victim because they sound, in most cases, they don't sound like we are the voices. Oh yeah. No, they sound just like the victim's regular thoughts, like the tens of thousands of thoughts you have go through your head on a regular basis.
right.
But the content and the intention of those thoughts is very negative.
Mm,
All right. So they're like intrusive thoughts,
mm,
but the patient still hears them.
mm,
They're like obsessive negative thoughts. Right? And of course, psychiatry never asks, and psychology doesn't either, where thoughts come from, because they can't measure thoughts. They're energetic. They can't measure the voices. They're energetic. So they're fixated on whatever you can't measure doesn't exist. And they're not going to be able to measure anything that has to do with schizophrenia except the symptoms of the victim. Right? So this list that I'm reading you, this is the operational definition of these voices. Um, this is what they are. It's what they do is what they are. Um, I'd hand out the 23rd Psalm to a lot of these patients and they would lose it or they would forget to recite it. So these voices can make them forget things. They make them fill their minds with negative thoughts about other people. Oh, they're lying to you, or they're plotting to hurt you, or they're talking behind your back. I mean, they want to divide these people off so they're isolated. And the more isolated they get, the less distractions the voices have to get at them. Okay? They destroy any sort of positive concept the person has. Um, they start manipulating reality. Like if the guy's walking down the sidewalk and on the other side of the street, a couple of people start laughing, they'll tell him they're laughing at you.
right.
It's the ideas of reference that all these things happening are negative and they're happening against them. Um, they have an aversion to anything positive or beautiful. Um, the voices don't want anybody to know about them. They don't want them telling anybody about them. They break up marriages, they break up relationships. Uh, they want the person isolated. Mm.
Right.
So psychiatry is still doing this. They're still telling them they're hallucinations.
Right. So my question is, so obviously the psychiatric mafia is pretty adamant that this is connected to some gene or some combination of genes, and any day now we're going to find the cause. The cause is purely physiological. In your own research, in your own experience, do you feel like you might have some sort of a theory on what the cause of this is? I know earlier you had mentioned something along the lines of like trauma or something like that. But if we know that the condition is worsened and perpetuated by, negative energy or negative energy environments, do you feel like, in your experience, you've noticed like something that might cause this pretty
Oh yeah,
reliably, or is it okay?
yeah, no, yeah, yeah. Um, physical, mental, emotional, and sexual abuse. You know, severe physical, emotional, and sexual abuse will bring it on. The other thing that I've seen most commonly bring it on is methamphetamine. The prison is full of prisoners who went psychotic using meth,
Hmm.
you know, and it starts off with, they feel like Superman. They can stay up. They can get all kinds of stuff done. They feel great. They have lots of energy. So they like the feeling. And then they crash. And eventually they start hearing voices when they're high and they go, oh, well, that's just a hallucination. And they think, oh, it'll go away when I come down. And it does, right? For a while. So they might do it, you know, I don't know, 15, 20, 25 times and the voices go away. And then one day they don't.
Hmm.
And they're there forever.
Hmm.
They're permanent. They
Hmm.
stay. And they're just as psychotic as anybody who went psychotic by any other means. You know, the prison is full of meth addicts who are psychotic and hearing voices.
Hmm.
You know, and cocaine does that too, to a lesser degree.
Hmm.
You know. But yeah, um, you won't find too many schizophrenics who weren't badly abused
Hmm.
in their background.
Hmm.
Mm.
And so on top of, the 23rd Psalm, and also just trying to, I guess you could say, place yourself in higher energy environments, or trying to, focus on positive things. You outlined a couple things at the end of the book that it would be good for um, people who are experiencing these symptoms to stay away from, and then also things to try to engage more in. One of them you had mentioned was, positive relationships and stuff like that. The voices seem to try to isolate individuals. One of the things I thought was kind of interesting was you mentioned murder mysteries and also acid rock and rap music. I thought that was very interesting. Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Oh yeah, they want to drive the victim toward negative stuff,
Hmm.
violent video games.
Hmm.
There's lots of times where I get contacted by mothers and uh, they want me to do something to help their sons. And I find out they're playing violent video games, and boy, they don't want to give that up.
Right.
It's like they're addicted to it.
Hmm.
And same thing with television. You look at television, and it's like there's all these murders on television all the time.
Hmm.
The screen is full of war and killing and violence. And by the time a teenager gets to be a teenager, he's watched tens of thousands of murders on television all the time.
Hmm.
War stories and newscasters of this guy murdered this guy, and um, the way to solve your problems is freaking get a gun and go shoot somebody.
Hmm.
Mm. And then they want to take away your guns. The deep state. When
Right.
they're the ones that are fostering this in the first place.
Right.
They won't curve these television these nasty murders on television, these violent movies, these violent uh, they have these shows where what are they investigative things where somebody gets murdered and they go through the whole thing. I
Right.
mean, all that is adding to
Okay.
it.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I think the statistics on the number of people in America, especially who are on, SSRIs or some sort of antidepressant drug, it seems like you know, American culture, really Western culture at large, is sort of preoccupied with trying to treat the physical, or attributing all maladies to something physical, and just completely ignoring the spiritual component. And it leads to situations, unfortunately, like the one you've been describing tonight, where you have people who are clearly showing there's a pattern to all of these symptoms. There's a pattern to these voices experienced by schizophrenics, and yet it seems almost like we're not really able to be honest about what's causing them, what the correlations between all these individuals and their pathologies are, and like what tends to help. And I mean, it's like you can't even suggest something spiritual as any sort of a solution, or you're looked at as sort of um, you know, like a quack or something.
Yeah.
And but
Yeah.
in your experience, did you find that, when people were repeating the 23rd Psalm or when they were following these sort of soft prescriptives that things tended to get better? You know,
No, they would get worse
okay,
because the voices don't like it.
okay,
They'd kick up and they would try to make them stop it.
okay.
All right. So they would get louder, they'd get more vehement when somebody started going to church or praying or reading the Bible or something like that. They
Hmm.
react against it,
Hmm. Hmm.
you know. So that's another thing where, this is making things worse. They want them to quit.
Right, right.
Right?
So just if I were to play devil's advocate here, so one of the things you were talking about earlier is that, in the case of the drugs that people were being prescribed, a lot of times the drugs would result in negative side effects. They would sort of debilitate the person, sometimes shrink their brain, cause them to be super low energy, and just have all these negative, nasty side effects. Um, my question would be, if we have identified that these voices like these patients to be in a low energy state, or they sort of feed off of negative energy coming from the patient, why do you think it seems like the voices would encourage patients to like get off of the drugs rather than stay on them? If the drugs are, in some ways kind of like harmful and keeping them in a low energy state.
Well, what the drugs do is they drug them down.
Hmm.
So they turn them into zombies.
Hmm.
So it's much harder for these voices to generate the negative emotional energy that they need to feed off of
Hmm.
when these guys are drugged down, because it's much harder to get them all worked up into a negative state. They're like, semi-zombies.
Hmm.
It's a lot harder to get them worked up.
Okay.
So they don't want them on those drugs.
Okay. I see. So it's not merely having them sort of tired and it's more like the voices seem to want to have um you know a virile vehicle to sort of siphon passions off of rather than something that's or someone who's sort of doped up and can't really go and cause as much
Yeah,
havoc, I guess.
they need to get them, angry. They want people angry and rageful and um, you know, feel they want the lower vibrational emotions.
Hmm. Hmm.
They can't deal with somebody who's vibrating at a high spiritual level.
Hmm.
But they hit us all. It's not just the schizophrenics they hit. You know, you ever been walking down the street and all of a sudden this horrible thought comes into your head out of nowhere? Not even that something that you were even thinking about, you
Right.
know. And it's like, where did that come from?
Right.
You know, you know, that's not your thought.
Hmm.
They're putting those thoughts in there.
Hmm.
I had a guy write me not too long ago. He said, um, "Yeah, what you're saying is true. I was standing behind my boss the other day, and I had this loud, uh, you know, intrusive thought barge into my head and said, spit on him." You know, so yeah, or you're standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon and something's telling you, I wonder what it would be like to jump. Or you're
Hmm.
standing on a bridge and you go, what, or what would it be like to drive into oncoming traffic? Stuff like
Right.
that. They hit us all.
Right. And I think what's interesting about that is in the case of this sudden urge to jump out of nowhere. What's funny is earlier you had mentioned how, these voices they urged one person to gouge out his eyeball under the guise that this would be a good idea or something. And then when he does it, they sort of laugh at him, mock him, accuse him. What's interesting about the whole jumping off the bridge thing is I think it's something like three-fourths of all Golden Gate Bridge jumpers who survive actually said that the moment that they stepped off the ledge, they immediately felt regret, which is, I think, kind of correlates with the person who gouged his eye out, or a lot of these cases where it seems like these voices tend to goad someone into engaging in a negative behavior, and then like sort of ridicule and mock the person for having followed their suggestion, which is, the term Satan literally just means accuser. And so I find that kind of an interesting thing here. So, um, one thing you mentioned was in your book, the difference between what you called higher and lower order spirits, or I don't know if you called them spirits, higher or lower order voices. Can you kind of like break that down for us? Like what's meant there?
Well, that came from Wilson Van Dusen. He wrote about that. He was a clinical psychologist I worked with for a while up in he was in Northern California working at a state hospital up there. And he was reading the works of Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a Christian mystic who lived what was it, 700 years ago, 300 years ago, 1700s. And he was given complete access to heaven and hell. And he went and he talked to angels and he talked to demons. And the stuff he wrote about demons was what Van Dusen and I were seeing in the schizophrenics. Right? They behaved the same way that Manuel Swedenborg described demons, or devils.
Mhm.
And Van Dusen was a Swedenborgian, and he started questioning the voices like I did. Only he was trying to make friends with them to find out more about them. And when I met them, I knew they were rotten and they were evil, and I wasn't making friends with them. I was trying to figure out ways to kill them. And he did a couple of interesting things. He didn't find out much about them because they were consummate liars. They lied about everything, and they didn't want to tell him anything. But he kept calling them hallucinations, even though he didn't treat them that way. He carried on conversations with them, you know. Um, but what he did do is he had these, cutting edge psychological tests, the MMPI and the Rorschach, that kind of stuff. And he would give these tests independently to the voices and to the patient. So he would tell the patient, I just want to give these tests to your voices, you stay out of it. And then he'd tell the voices, you stay out of it, I just want to give it to the patient. And he got completely different results with the voices showing up to be more psychotic than the patient, which was interesting. Um, so Van Dusen didn't want to rock the boat too much, so he kept referring to them as hallucinations, although the way he behaved as if they were demons.
Mhm.
He didn't want to get in trouble with the psychological mafia. Mm. But they had the MO of exactly what Swedenborg was writing about.
So on the topic of Swedenborg, do you care to kind of give us your thoughts on Swedenborg? Is he a big sort of focus in your own personal work, or is he just
Oh
someone?
yeah, he is.
Okay.
Yes, he is. So Swedenborg was one of the top scientists of his day back in the 1700s. He was kind of like the Leonardo da Vinci of Sweden. He was the chief mining engineer for the Queen of Sweden. Um, he was psychic. Um, he was brilliant. He studied virtually everywhere in Europe. He was the son of a preacher. Um, he was very devout, um, and he was a member of the Queen's court. And the Queen at that time was carrying on some kind of illicit affair with one of the enemies of the country of Sweden, right? And that guy had died, and he had left her some kind of message that she didn't receive. So Swedenborg could go to the other side and get information and then come back with it to prove to be true. But one time, here's this lady who was the wife of a silversmith, and her husband had created this big silver tea setting for a rich customer, and the customer didn't pay her. The customer said, "I need you need to show me the receipt, or I'm not going to pay you." right? So she didn't know where it was. She went to Swedenborg and she says, I have no job. My kids are starving. Can you tell me where my husband put this receipt? So the next day, after a day, and sleeping on it, he came back and he said, okay, I know where it is. And he said it's in there's a false drawer in his desk. Open up the one of the drawers and then take away the back piece, and the receipt is behind that back piece. And they opened it up, and there was the receipt. Right? So he didn't like doing that, but he would do that to help people out. He would go to the other side and get in touch with people who had died. Um, so the Queen of Sweden wanted him to go talk to her secret lover and find out what was the last thing that he left for her. What did he have to say to her before he died? And he went and he got that information. He brought it back to her court, and she said, "Oh, just tell me what he said. I don't, I have no secrets from my inner court." He said, "No, no, I'm not going to do that." So he went up and he whispered it to her, and she fainted, dropped on the floor. And whatever he said just
Horrible.
shocked her so bad that she fainted.
Yeah.
Uh, so there's another time he was having dinner with a bunch of people, and he looks at one of the guys at the table and he said, "Your barn is about to burn down. You better get back there." So the guy runs and gets to his barn uh, just as one of the cows knocked over a lantern and set the barn on fire. Mm. So he was precognitive like that. At the age of around 50, he said he saw Jesus show up to him and said, "Okay, stop all this scientific stuff with the physical world. I'm going to give you access to heaven and hell. I want you to interview people in both those places and then come back and write about it so the people on earth know that there's a heaven and hell and know what it's like." Okay? So he did that. He did write a book called Heaven and Hell. And he talks to angels and demons. And the interviews that he had with demons were virtually what we're seeing in with the voices in paranoid schizophrenia.
So, something I kind of wanted to bring up is essentially, um, so in this book here, we actually have a quote from Swedenborg, where he says, when spirits begin to speak with man, he must beware lest he believe them in anything, for they say almost anything. Things are fabricated by them, and they lie. For if they were permitted to relate what heaven is and how things are in the heavens, they would tell so many lies, and indeed with a solemn affirmation, that man would be astonished. They are extremely fond of fabricating, and whenever any subject of discourse is proposed, they think that they know it and give their opinions one after another, one in one way and another in another, altogether as if they knew. And if a man listens and believes, they press on and deceive and seduce in diverse ways. My question is, so we hear in Van Dusen's work that there seems to be a delineation between a lower order and a sort of higher order of voices, or in this case, you could maybe even classify them as entities or
Yes,
personalities,
spirits.
spirits. And so, my question is, um, what are your thoughts on Second Corinthians 11:14, where Paul essentially says that even Satan himself can masquerade as an angel of light?
Oh yeah. There's a lot of times where the patient would ask voices, like that one that I talked to, where this guy believed he was Jesus Christ. And there's a lot of them that do that. They believe they're Jesus Christ, or that they're talking to some uh, innocuous spirit. Especially these guys using Ouija boards. There are people that I know that went psychotic using Ouija boards. They started communicating with these spirits on the Ouija board, and then the next thing they know, they're hearing them in their heads, and they won't leave. Right? Ouija boards aren't toys. They shouldn't be selling those things. They should be banned. They're
Hmm.
very dangerous.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, f fully agree with you there. Fully agree with you there. Luckily, I've never. I did have a period of time where I was a kid, very, very foolish and experimenting with a lot of stupid things. Luckily, Ouija board was never one of those things. But my wife, I think it was one of her family members actually experimented with a Ouija board just for fun, and it quickly turned into something that was like pretty negative. But there's a thing. I think the main message for today really is just that. Um, Even if you're coming at things from the point of view of someone who is sort of scientific, you're kind of coming at this with a thesis. You're trying to look for patterns. You're not trying to come away with any particular conclusion. You're just trying to look at the facts and sort of assess what the reality of things is. To me, it's almost sort of undeniable that there's a spiritual reality here, like at play.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
and when you don't sort of have that as part of your framework, you come away with sort of an incomplete picture of what's at play here. Because no doubt the physiological plays a massive role, but if you ignore the spiritual, then it's sort of it can lead to perilous circumstances. Um, so Jerry, any closing thoughts for today? Anything you'd like to kind of leave people with? Anything you'd like to sort of plug? Your book, anything like that?
Well, yeah, you can go here and you could see how we came to the conclusion. Now, this is written by me and Sherry Sweeney. Sherry Sweeney actually heard voices when she was younger. It's called an amazing journey into the psychotic mind. So after we had some, it took, yeah, we were working on prison reform together for 10 years before she told me that she heard voices as a youngster. And I had a hard time believing that because she's one of the most spiritual people I've ever known. And so I started asking her questions that only somebody who heard voices could answer correctly, right? And she boom, 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 you know, right away. She had all the answers right. And I'm like, holy cow. So after some discussions, we went, we got to let people know about this. We need to wake them up because the psychiatric mafia is lying to these people. The big pharma is feeding them poisons, and the cause of schizophrenia is not any genetic anything. It's not any kind of chemical brain imbalance. It's the voices. And if you can get rid of the voices by any means, all the symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia disappear with them. You know, whether that be exorcism or uh, um, medication. Sometimes the voices will go away when you take the medication, but only temporarily. You stop taking the meds and they come right back.
Hmm.
So these drugs are not curing anything. They're merely treating symptoms. It's not to say that they're not useful, because I've seen patients that were so violent that that's the only way you could deal with them, is you had to drug them down. You had to knock them out with these medications. There's people who can't function without those medications, you know, but that's not the cause of schizophrenia. They're only treating symptoms, and they're doing damage while they're doing it. I mean, those drugs are rotting out the brain, they're rotting out the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. So when these negative symptoms start appearing, then the psychiatric mafia adds another drug that suppresses those symptoms that are giving the person an indication that their nervous system is being destroyed. So what they're doing is vile, and then they're saying there is no other treatment. Bullcrap, there is no other treatment. There's other treatments for schizophrenia. You know, it's the Mace energy method is one that will help in minor cases of schizophrenia and will get rid of the trauma that these people uh, have suffered. So if you get rid of the trauma, the voices start lessening. They don't have as much to feed off of. Uh, so you can go. We've done some videos on MACE in my website. It's a new energetic psychotherapy. So it's nothing like traditional psychotherapy. It takes into account that your mind is energy, your thoughts are energy, your memory is energy, your spirit is energy. You're an energy unit, and that this energy has been disrupted, and it's causing disruption in the flow of your energy field. And it will go in there and it will remove those negative identities, those big blocks of negative energy. And the person feels much, much better. You know, regular psychotherapy doesn't work. This was the first therapy that I'd ever seen in my entire uh, career that actually works. It actually gets at the cause of mental illness, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, that kind of stuff. And it actually will cure it
Mhm.
most of the time.
Mhm.
You you can read about it on my website at jerrymarzinsky.com. We got some videos on it. Or go to causisminstitute.com. It's a cutting edge energetic psychotherapy that really works.
Yeah. Guys, go check out jerrymarzinsky.com. Jerry, thank you very much for coming on the show today. It was a
Okay.
pleasure.
Right. You're more than welcome.
All right.